Okay, so we're gonna move back in the textbook and now cover chemical messengers and the endocrine system. So these are covered in chapters 5 and 6, right? We skipped over them because at the beginning of the semester, most of you are going cross-eyed with all the chemistry. Okay, so I put it later in the semester, and it also makes it nice because we've covered a bunch of the body systems. So when we talk about the hormones that control the body systems, it's less memorization and more understanding, right? So we're going to do just some basics of chemical messengers and cell signaling, and then we'll talk about the endocrine system in specific. The endocrine system uses chemical messengers. Okay, there are different types of cell signaling. There is direct cell signaling where we have gap junctions. What kind of cells have we talked about that have gap junctions? Cardiac muscle cells, right? So those gap junctions allow that wave of depolarization to move from cell to cell so that we get the atria contracting at once and the ventricles contracting at once. Okay, so you guys know all about direct cell signaling. What we're going to talk in a little more detail about is indirect cell signaling. So in indirect, right, there's a signaling cell that has to release a chemical messenger into the extracellular fluid. Okay, and then the target cell has to have a receptor for that chemical messenger. And when the chemical messenger binds to the receptor, it starts what's called a signal transduction pathway, which leads to a response. And we talked about this when we talked about how our taste buds detect the different types of tastins, right? So when we talked about sweet molecules, things like glucose or fructose or artificial sweeteners binds to a receptor that has the binding site on the extracellular side. Right? So glucose doesn't actually enter your taste buds, it just binds to a receptor, and that causes a signal transduction pathway, which then causes depolarization of the taste bud cell, so then it releases neurotransmitter and causes action potentials on those afferent neurons. Okay? So when we talked about the nervous system, we talked about a lot of different types of cell signaling. Okay? Cell signaling can be separated into short distance signaling and long distance signaling. Short distance is when you either have a paracrine or an autocrine. Paracrine chemical messengers just diffuse to a nearby cell. Okay, so the signaling cell releases them, diffuses to a nearby cell, causes a response in that nearby cell. So we talked about various chemical messengers or paracrine chemical messengers when we talked about the platelet plug formation, right? The platelets release ADP, which causes nearby platelets to become sticky, and then they release ADP, which then causes more nearby platelets to release ADP. So in that case, ADP is a paracrine chemical messenger. Okay? That ADP is also autocrine, because it diffuses back to the signaling cell, those platelets, because the platelets all have receptors for ADP. And when they bind ADP, they become sticky too. Okay, so nearby platelets become sticky, as well as the cell releasing ADP becomes sticky. Okay, so chemical messengers can be either paracrine or autocrine, or they could be both. Okay, long distance chemical messaging, or cell signaling, involves the endocrine system or the nervous system. Okay? Endocrine system, chemical messengers used by the endocrine system are called hormones. And the difference between a paracrine and an autocrine chemical messenger and a hormone is that hormones are always released into the bloodstream. Paracrine and autocrine could be released into the bloodstream, or they could be just released into extracellular fluid. Okay, but they're not traveling long distances to their target cell. Okay, we talked in detail about neural cell signaling, okay, where we have an action potential that travels down an axon, right, and then causes the release of neurotransmitter. Right, so here we have this cartoon showing the different types of cell signaling. So here we have direct, so these could be two adjacent myocardiocytes. We've got gap junctions. Okay, here's autocrine and or paracrine. So we've got a signaling cell, maybe it's a platelet. It's releasing ADP. Nearby platelets bind that ATP, causes signal transduction, they become sticky. Okay, the ADP that's released from the platelet also binds to receptors on that platelet, causes signal transduction and the same response. Okay, the immune cells also use a lot of autocrine and paracrine chemical messengers, right, where they affect nearby immune cells as well as the immune cell releasing the chemical messenger. Endocrine signaling, the signaling cell is always an endocrine cell. It releases the hormone into the bloodstream. Hormone is transported in the bloodstream, binds to a receptor on the target cell, signal transduction, some sort of response. Okay, so insulin, right? Insulin is a hormone that binds to receptors on insulin-sensitive cells. So an insulin-sensitive cell is any cell that has a receptor for insulin. Things like skeletal muscle, hepatocytes in the liver, adipocytes all have insulin receptors. When insulin binds to the receptor, the signal transduction pathway leads to the response where glucose transporters get put on the plasma membrane. So those insulin-sensitive cells start to absorb glucose. That decreases blood glucose levels, right? So you release insulin in response to an increase in blood glucose level. Right. Neural signaling, again, you guys are super familiar with, right? You've got a neuron, fires an action potential, causes the release of neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messenger, which then binds to receptors on the target cell. And those receptors might open an ion channel and cause depolarization, right? Or they might bind to something like a cholinergic receptor, okay, or an adrenergic receptor, an activated GProtein, which might open or close an ion channel. Okay, direct cell signaling is really rapid, right? But it's only for short distances because the cells have to touch each other, right? So direct cell signaling is where there are gap junctions between adjacent cells. And this allows water-soluble molecules to freely move between those adjacent cells. Okay, and we talked about these when we talked about electrical synapses in the nervous system, which aren't super common. Okay. But sometimes you do have neurons or neurons and glial cells with gap junctions, so those action potentials can spread from cell to cell. But they're super common in the cardiac contractile cells, so that the atria can contract as a unit and the ventricles can contract as a unit. That's all we're going to say for direct cell signaling. Okay, now we're going to talk specifically about indirect cell signaling. Okay, and we're going to break it down into 3 steps. And then we're going to talk about how those steps differ for hydrophilic versus hydrophobic chemical messengers. Okay. What does hydrophilic mean?
Water-loving.
Water-loving. So what kind of molecules are hydrophilic? Polar molecules. What does it mean to be polar? Right, anything charged, so anything that's given off or taken up an electron is going to be charged and therefore water soluble. But does something have to be charged in order for it to be hydrophilic? No. What does it often have a lot of? What are those functional groups you see a lot of on carbohydrates which are polar? Who remembers?
Alcohol.
Hydroxyl. The hydroxyl groups, those OH groups. Okay, because the oxygen hogs the electrons, right? So you get a net positive charge on the hydrogen, net negative charge on the oxygen. Okay, so polar molecules just have unequal sharing of electrons, right? And then they'll interact with water, which is also a polar molecule, because oxygen hogs the electrons from the 2 hydrogen ions. Okay, so anything that dissolves in water is hydrophilic. Okay, what are hydrophobic molecules?
Non-polar.
They're nonpolar, right? Do they dissolve in water? No. So they separate. Okay, so what are some examples of nonpolar molecules in the body? We just spent some time talking about two of them and the system that transports them. Oxygen and CO2. I heard that whisper up there. Okay, oxygen and CO2 are considered nonpolar, right? Lipids, yeah, so fatty acids, triglycerides, all nonpolar. Who knows what class of hormones are nonpolar? Males and females have different ones of these. Testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are all blank hormones. What kind of hormones are they? Starts with an S. That's true, they are sex hormones. You're right, that does start with an S. An ST. Let me add another letter. They're all steroid hormones. Okay, all the steroid hormones are hydrophobic. Okay. So hydrophilic versus hydrophobic molecules are released from their signaling cell differently. Okay? I'm going to give you a big hint for this. All neurotransmitters are hydrophilic. Okay, how are hydrophilic chemical messengers released from their signaling cells? If all neurotransmitters are hydrophilic, as your hint, how are hydrophilic chemical messengers released? Exocytosis. Okay, so if you just remember that all neurotransmitters are hydrophilic, and you know that neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis, that's how all hydrophilic chemical messengers get released by their signaling cells. What can hydrophobic molecules do at a plasma membrane? Just cross it, right? Okay, so hydrophobic chemical messengers just diffuse out of the signaling cell. Okay, transport the messenger through the extracellular environment to the target cell. Okay, all extracellular fluid is primarily what molecule? What's the solvent? Water. Exactly. Okay, so extracellular fluid is primarily water. So hydrophilic molecules do what in water? What does glucose do in water? It just dissolves. Hydrophilic chemical messengers just dissolve in extracellular fluid. Okay. Oxygen is hydrophobic. How is oxygen transported in blood? Bound by hemoglobin, so it has a carrier molecule. Okay, hydrophobic chemical messengers have to be bound to carrier molecules. Okay, communication of the signal to the target cell. This is all about where the receptor is. Okay, hydrophilic chemical messengers, receptors, are always binding site on the extracellular side. Okay, so this means hydrophilic chemical messengers don't enter their target cells. They bind to receptors where the binding site is extracellular. Okay, what do hydrophobic molecules do when they see a plasma membrane? Are they blocked by it? No, they just cross it. So hydrophobic chemical messengers, the receptors are intracellular. Okay. So we'll go through more details about how cell signaling works starting on Monday. Okay. So hydrophilic versus hydrophobic chemical messengers get released from their signaling cells in different ways. Okay, so hydrophobic or lipophilic substances can just cross cellular membranes. Okay, membranes can't hold them back. They just diffuse away from the signaling cell. Because they can just diffuse away and they can't be held in vesicles, this means they have to be made on demand. Okay? The hydrophobic chemical messengers that we're going to talk about that are hormones are the steroid hormones. If you think about the steroid hormones, things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, and aldosterone, those are all synthesized on demand and just diffuse away from the cells that make them. Okay? Hydrophilic chemical messengers can be wrapped in a membrane and stored. Right? And the way they're released is that membrane fuses with the plasma membrane. So the vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane and releases its contents to the extracellular environment, which is called exocytosis. And I mentioned the way you can remember this is that all neurotransmitters are water soluble. So as long as you remember how neurotransmitters are released from the signaling cell, you know how all water soluble chemical messengers are released from the signaling cell. Okay, so this means they can be stored and released on demand. Okay, hydrophilic substances dissolve in water. Water is the solvent inside your body. Okay, so hydrophilic chemical messengers are released by exocytosis. They just dissolve in extracellular fluid. They just dissolve in plasma. Okay, and that's how they're transported to their target cell. Because they're just dissolved in water, that means they are available for excretion. Okay, water-soluble substances get filtered out by the kidneys. So hydrophilic chemical messengers have short half-lives. Okay, and what's a half-life? What do you think half-life is? What? You can say it out loud.
No.
I bet you're right. No? It's, yes, in the back.
It's the time that it takes for the original amount to half of it to be empty in the body.
Exactly. It's the time it takes to remove half of the original amount. So insulin has a really short half-life. It's less than 10 minutes. Okay, so you eat a boatload of sugar, your pancreas releases insulin from the beta cells by exocytosis, and you get this huge increase in insulin. You get a spike in insulin. And then within 10 minutes, half of that is gone. And in another 10 minutes, another half is gone. Right? So hydrophilic chemical messengers have short half-lives, meaning they're quickly removed from the bloodstream. So that means they are short-acting. Okay? Hydrophilic chemical messengers are short-acting. Hydrophobic chemical messengers, because they don't want to dissolve in water, have to be bound to a carrier protein. So that means less than 1% of a hydrophobic hormone is free at any given time. And that means free to be excreted. So hydrophobic chemical messengers have long half-lives. Right? They stay in the bloodstream for a long period of time. And cortisol's half-life is 90 minutes, which isn't even that long for a steroid hormone. Okay, estrogen and progesterone and testosterone all have multiple hour-long half-lives. Okay, so because they stay in the bloodstream for longer, they have longer-lasting effects. Okay, the third step, communication to the target cell, is all about where the receptor is. Hydrophilic chemical messengers never enter their target cells. They bind to transmembrane receptors where the receptor sites or the ligand binding portion of the receptor is extracellular. So receptor A and receptor B are for hydrophilic chemical messengers. Hydrophobic chemical messengers can cross plasma membranes, so their receptors are intracellular. Okay? A ligand is anything that binds to a receptor. So something could be called a hormone, a chemical messenger, and a ligand. Okay, so testosterone is both a hormone, a chemical messenger, and a ligand. Okay. Chemical messengers bind to receptors, and then the receptors start what's called a signal transduction pathway. Okay, so the binding of the ligand to the receptor causes signal transduction. So if you have a ligand that binds to ligand-gated ion channel, what happens when that ligand binds? So say this is a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. When acetylcholine binds to nicotinic cholinergic receptors, what happens?
Opens.
It opens, and what happens? It depolarizes. So for nicotinic cholinergic receptors, these ligand-gated ion channels are non-specific cation channels. So sodium rushes in, some potassium leaves, but it depolarizes the cell. And that's the signal transduction, the depolarization. Okay? You have things called receptor enzymes. So when the ligand binds, that activates an enzyme on the intracellular portion, and that is what causes the signal transduction. Okay, activation of the enzyme, and then that enzyme usually activates a second messenger. We'll talk about second messengers in just a second. Okay, G-protein coupled receptors. We talked about these when we talked about taste receptor cells and photoreceptors. Okay, so when a ligand binds to G-protein coupled receptor, the intracellular portion activates the G-protein, and then the G-protein does something, and then you get a second messenger formed, and that's what causes signal transduction. Okay, and then we'll talk about what happens when a ligand binds to an intracellular receptor. Okay, so intracellular receptors are for hydrophobic chemical messengers. Okay, those hydrophobic ligands just diffuse into the cells. And you can have cytoplasmic receptors, or oftentimes the receptors for hydrophobic hormones are actually in the nucleus. And they're called nuclear receptors. Because in general, what happens is when a hydrophobic hormone binds to its receptor, either a cytoplasmic or nuclear receptor, it starts gene transcription. Okay, so this hormone receptor complex causes gene transcription. Okay, formation of messenger RNA, which is then going to leave the nucleus, where it's going to be translated into protein. Okay. So testosterone. Why do people take testosterone? What does it do? It does what? It intensifies workouts. I mean, it allows you to lift more because what gets bigger? Testosterone makes your muscles bigger. So what happens is testosterone is hydrophobic. It's going to enter your skeletal muscle cells, and it's going to enter the nuclei. Remember, your skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. Okay, it's going to bind to a nuclear receptor, and it's going to cause the transcription and translation of more actin and myosin. Right? And it's going to cause more myofibrils to be made, increase the size of those muscle cells. Okay, so testosterone causes the synthesis of new proteins. Okay, hydrophobic chemical messengers have long-lasting effects because they cause the synthesis of new proteins. Okay, but they're slow, because making new proteins takes time. Okay, so hydrophobic chemical messengers have slow responses but long-lasting responses. Okay, hydrophilic chemical messengers have rapid responses, but they're short-acting. So if we think about neurotransmitters that bind to ligand-gated ion channels like acetylcholine and a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, okay, really rapid response. You get a rapid change in membrane potential, which might depolarize the postsynaptic cell and cause it to fire an action potential. But that is a really rapid, short-term response. Okay, enzyme-linked receptors are also for hydrophilic chemical messengers. Okay, ligand binding site is extracellular. Intracellular portion is an enzyme. And generally what this enzyme does is it phosphorylates things. Okay, so it takes a phosphate group off of ATP and it puts it onto a protein that is already present on the cell. And when you phosphorylate proteins, you turn them on. Okay, so these enzyme-linked receptors turn on proteins that are already made. So rapid but again, short-term response, because very quickly this protein might get dephosphorylated and turned off. Okay, so you're going to turn on and turn off proteins. Okay, the only hormone we're going to talk about that works through this enzyme-linked receptor is atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, most hormones, hydrophilic hormones, work by GProtein coupled receptors. Okay, we already talked about GProtein coupled receptors that open ion channels when we were talking about the effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system on the autorhythmic cells in the heart. Okay, so you have a hydrophilic chemical messenger, binds to the extracellular side of the GProtein coupled receptor. The intracellular side is associated with the GProtein. Okay, when the messenger binds, the GProtein disassociates from the receptor, and in this case it goes and it opens or closes an ion channel. Okay, this is a really rapid response, and it depolarizes or hyperpolarizes the cell, so it's short-acting. For hormones, more commonly, when that GProtein gets activated, instead of opening an ion channel, it activates what's called an amplifier enzyme. Okay, so we have the hydrophilic chemical messenger binding to the receptor. When it binds, activates the GProtein. GProtein then goes and activates this amplifier enzyme. And what this amplifier enzyme does is it activates a second messenger. Okay, so this is the first messenger, the ligand. This is the second messenger. Okay, and then the second messenger activates or inhibits cellular pathways. We're being really vague. Okay. So your book has this really nice table of common second messengers. Okay. A really common one is cyclic AMP, which is made from ATP. The GProtein activates the amplifier enzyme adenylate cyclase, right, which then takes ATP and converts it into cyclic AMP. And then this activates a kinase, and kinases phosphorylate things. Okay, so it turns on proteins. And look, activates a kinase, activates a kinase. Okay, so we have 3 second messengers that phosphorylate proteins that are already made in the cell. Okay, so cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, diacylglycerol. Okay, we've got 2. Oh, wait. So this one also activates a kinase. Here's one that stimulates calcium release. Where's calcium normally in high concentration? Intracellular, extracellular? Extracellular. Okay, so having increase in calcium inside a cell also acts as a second messenger. Okay, so that's the way inositol triphosphate works, and then here we've got calcium acting as the second messenger. Okay, you don't need to memorize this table. Just be familiar that these are all common second messengers. So cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, DAG, inositol triphosphate, and calcium. And what they do is turn on proteins that are already made. Okay? So rapid response, but it's short acting. Okay. Any questions about the boring part, the basics? Yes?
Sorry, on that table you said we need to recognize the second messengers, but they are proteins that turn,
Oh, need to recognize that they are second messengers. So if I ask you what cyclic AMP is, you would know it's a second messenger, and that it causes proteins that are already made to be turned on.
Okay. And it's a rapid?
It's rapid. Short acting, but rapid. Okay? Hydrophobic chemical messengers cause gene transcription and the making of new proteins. Okay, so hydrophobic cause new proteins to be made. It's slow but long-lasting. Hydrophilic turn on proteins that are already made, so it's rapid but short-acting. Okay. So what we're going to do next is talk about the endocrine system in particular. But you want to think about whether it's hydrophilic or hydrophobic, and then these 3 steps in terms of how it's released, how it's transported, and the type of effect it's going to have on the receiving cell. Okay, so our endocrine system is made up of ductless endocrine glands. Remember, exocrine glands have ducts and secrete their product to the external environment. Endocrine glands are ductless and secrete their product into the internal environment. Okay. Endocrine glands or endocrine cells secrete hormones that travel through the bloodstream to their target cells. Okay. And a target cell has a receptor for that hormone, and that hormone regulates or directs a particular function. So insulin. Okay. Insulin has target cells that have insulin receptors like skeletal muscle, hepatocytes, and adipocytes. Okay. Insulin is released in response to an increase in blood glucose. It tells the insulin-sensitive cells to absorb glucose, and so insulin causes blood glucose levels to come back to rest. Right? So insulin directs the decrease in blood glucose seen after a meal. Okay, so here we've got endocrine organs. We've got primary versus secondary endocrine organs. So the primary endocrine organs we're going to talk about, although we're going to talk in way more detail about the gonads at the end of the semester. Okay, so we're going to talk about the pineal gland and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, thymus, adrenal gland, pancreas, ovaries and testes, and then because this is a male, there's no placenta being shown, okay, or ovaries, except in this little sidebar. Okay, primary endocrine organs, their main role is to produce hormones. Secondary endocrine organs produce hormones, but that's not their main role. So what's the main role of your heart?
Pump blood.
Pump blood, okay? It also produces atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, how about your stomach and small intestine? What are the major roles of your stomach and small intestines? Digestion and absorption, okay? Liver produces some hormones, but its major roles in processing macronutrients that get absorbed, removing waste products from the bloodstream, okay? Kidney, removing waste products, as well as regulating the contents and volume of the extracellular fluid. Okay, your skin plays a role in activating vitamin D, right? But its major role is protection as well as making you look good, right? Okay, so our endocrine system helps regulate body functions that can happen on a slower timetable than those regulated by the nervous system. Okay, so we have 2 communication systems in our body, nervous system and endocrine system. Nervous system is for things that have to happen right away. Endocrine system is for things that can wait a few minutes, right? To hours, to days, to years, right? Your endocrine system helps regulate organic metabolism. So that's metabolism of carbohydrates, protein, and fats. Okay, and it also helps regulate water and electrolyte balance. Okay, controls kidney functions. Okay, your endocrine system plays a role in your stress response. Because remember, sympathetic nervous system directly innervates the adrenal medulla. Your adrenal glands are endocrine organs. Okay, and then we're going to also talk about cortisol, which is part of your stress response as well. Endocrine system plays a major role in growth and development, which is obviously something that has to be coordinated on a really long time scale. Okay. Helps control reproduction through the reproductive hormones, regulates red blood cell production. What hormone causes an increase in red blood cell numbers? Erythropoiesis. And what organ produces it? Kidneys, which are a secondary endocrine organ. Okay, and then in concert with the autonomic nervous system, it helps control both circulation and digestion and absorption of food. Okay, so your GI tract is under both neural and endocrine control. Okay, secondary endocrine organs produce hormones, but that's not their major role. So the heart produces atrial natriuretic peptide, which helps lower blood pressure, but its major role is to pump your blood. Okay, your kidneys produce erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell number, as well as renin. And renin plays a role in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone cascade, which helps increase blood pressure and cause sodium reabsorption. Okay, and then it also produces calcitriol, which plays a role in calcium balance. Okay, the GI tract produces loads of hormones, and we just have 3 listed here. So cholecystokinin is also known as CCK, secretin, gastrin. These play a role in determining when you feel full. Okay, what hormones are going to be, or not what hormones, what digestive enzymes are going to be released, how much gastric acid is going to be released, etc. Okay, and then your liver releases insulin-like growth factors. And they're insulin-like because they're similar to insulin in structure, not function. Right? So they're released in response to growth hormone being produced by your pituitary gland. So they help regulate growth of tissues as well as maintenance of tissues. Okay? And they're called insulin-like because they're like insulin in structure. Okay? They're also known as somatomedins, if you've ever heard of somatomedins. Same thing. Okay. So here's a really important slide. It's showing you the 3 chemical categories of hormones, and we're going to use this to talk about whether they are hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And I'm going to tell you which ones you should memorize and which ones you don't need to memorize. Okay, so the 3 major categories of hormones in humans are steroid hormones, peptide hormones, and amine hormones. And let's start with the steroid hormones. Are steroid hormones hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophobic, okay, they're being shown down here. They are made from cholesterol. Okay, memorize them. Not their structures, but their names. Okay, I'm not going to make you draw aldosterone. Memorize that aldosterone, cortisol, testosterone, estrogen or estradiol, and progesterone. So add progesterone to this. Are steroid hormones. Okay, progesterone is a precursor to testosterone, and testosterone is a precursor to estrogen. That's why there's a little arrow between testosterone and estradiol. So females do produce testosterone, but then they also produce the enzyme aromatase that converts testosterone to estradiol. Okay, these are all hydrophobic, and they follow all the hydrophobic rules. They diffuse away from their synthesizing cells, so they're made on demand. They're bound to carrier proteins, so they have long half-lives. They bind to intracellular receptors. They cause gene transcription, making of new proteins, so they have slow but long-lasting effects. Okay. The amine hormones are being shown up here with purple. Okay, amine hormones are synthesized from amino acids, either tyrosine or tryptophan. Okay, so tyrosine or tryptophan are the amino acids used to synthesize the amine hormones. Okay, tyrosine is made into the catecholamines and into thyroid hormone. The catecholamines, 2 of these should look familiar. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are used by which branch of the autonomic nervous system? Which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine? Sympathetic. Okay, and here's the difference between epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epinephrine has this methyl group right here, norepinephrine does not. So chemically they're really similar. Okay, they're hydrophilic. Really short half-lives. Okay, rapid responses but short-acting responses. Okay, dopamine is also a catecholamine. Okay, and it's also water-soluble. So all the catecholamines are water-soluble. Okay. Thyroid hormone's also made from tyrosine, but it's not water-soluble. Okay? Thyroid hormones are hydrophobic. Thyroid hormones are the only reason you need iodine in your diet. These are the only molecules in your body that have iodine in them. And there's the I's. Okay, so thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine or T4 has 4 iodines. Okay, triiodothyronine or T3 only has 3 iodines. This is the active form. Okay, so cells that are thyroid hormone sensitive, convert T4 into T3. Okay, who knows what thyroid hormone regulates? Anybody know? If you're hypothyroid, do you gain weight or lose weight? You gain weight. And if you're hyperthyroid, do you gain weight or lose weight? You lose weight. So what do you think thyroid hormone regulates? Metabolism. Okay. It is hydrophobic, right? But it doesn't follow all the rules. It gets stored by the thyroid glands. And we'll talk about that. So it breaks one of the hydrophobic rules. Okay? It's not released on demand. It actually gets stored. I mean, it's not made on demand. It gets stored. Okay? The last amine hormone is made from tryptophan, and that is melatonin. Okay, melatonin is hydrophilic. It's released by your pineal glands at different times during the day. When does your pineal gland release melatonin? During the day or at night? At night. Okay, so it's a hormone of darkness. Okay, it helps regulate your sleep cycle. Not because it's evil, right? Okay, you can take all of these hormones orally. Okay, peptide hormones are the last class. Okay, memorize the amine hormones, memorize the steroid hormones. The most common type of hormone in the human body are peptide hormones, so there's way too many to memorize. Okay, so memorize all the steroids and memorize all the amines. And then if I ask you on an exam question, blank, blank, blank hormone, and you don't recognize it as an amine or a steroid hormone, you know it's a peptide hormone. Okay? So that's how I recommend learning the peptide hormones. That anything that's not a steroid or amine hormone is a peptide by default. Okay? Peptide hormones are just chains of amino acids. So gonadotropin releasing hormone and insulin are 2 examples being given here. There's way more. They are all hydrophilic. Okay, so they're all released from the synthesizing cell by exocytosis, dissolve in the bloodstream, have extracellular receptor sites, cause signal transduction pathways to be activated, turn on proteins that are already made. Okay, so rapid, short-acting responses. You cannot take peptide hormones orally. Why not? What does your stomach do to peptides? It digests them. Okay? And this is what makes endocrinology such a difficult field. Right? Because the vast majority of hormones are peptide hormones, and you can't give people pills for them. And people want pills. Right? We like to pop pills. We do not like to get shots. Okay, so the hydrophilic hormones are the peptide hormones. Here's a slightly longer list, but this is not exhaustive. Luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, insulin, glucagon, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, all peptides. And then here we've got the catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. Hydrophilic. Oh, and melatonin. Sorry, skip that one. Hydrophobic are your steroid hormones, and here's the complete list: cortisol, aldosterone, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And then thyroid hormone. Okay, I am giving you this table from my comparative physiology classes textbook because it's actually a really nice table. Right? So I would recommend blowing this up or printing it on one full sheet and using it for study purposes. We're not going to go over it, but this is excellent for study purposes. Okay? So make sure you know it's here, print it out on a full page so you can read it or get a magnifying glass. Okay. Hormones sometimes cause the release of another hormone. Right? And that is called a trophic hormone. So trophic hormones cause the release of another hormone. They also stimulate or maintain their endocrine target tissues. So a classic example of this is the anterior pituitary gland releases the hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone then goes to the thyroid gland, and it tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay, so TSH doesn't have any direct actions on metabolism. It just tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone, and then thyroid hormone has the direct actions on metabolism. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone maintains the structural integrity of the thyroid gland. And if you don't have enough iodine in your diet, okay, you don't produce enough thyroid hormone because there's no iodine to make it. And your anterior pituitary just continuously sends a signal to your thyroid gland. And so your thyroid gland increases in size into what is called a goiter. Exactly. So a goiter forms when the anterior pituitary keeps sending thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. What we're going to do now is go through the primary endocrine organs. And we're going to separate them into central versus peripheral. Okay, central endocrine organs are in the brain. Okay, so this is the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which is the direct connection between nervous system and endocrine system. Okay, and then the pineal gland is also in the brain, and it secretes the hormone melatonin. And then we'll go through the peripheral endocrine organs, talk about the thyroid gland and parathyroid glands, thymus, adrenal glands, pancreas, and just briefly about the gonads. But we'll talk in way more detail about hormone regulation of the gonads when we talk about reproduction. Okay, so let's do the central endocrine glands first. So these are found within the central nervous system. Okay, your hypothalamus is part of your diencephalon. Okay, and it is directly connected to your pituitary gland. Okay, so this is the direct connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Your hypothalamus either releases or makes the hormones that the pituitary gland releases, or tells the pituitary gland exactly what hormones to release. Okay, so your hypothalamus controls your pituitary gland. And then here we've got the pineal gland back here, which is part of your brain as well. Okay. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the pituitary gland. We're going to go into the most depth when we talk about the pituitary gland for the endocrine system. So don't worry that we're going to go into this much depth for every endocrine organ. Okay? We're going to talk in detail about the pituitary gland. Okay? It's also known as the hypophysis. Okay? And it is located in the bony cavity just below your hypothalamus, and it's directly connected by this thin stalk. Okay? And your anterior and your posterior pituitary are anatomically and functionally distinct. Okay? So anterior and posterior pituitary glands are both anatomically and functionally distinct. Your posterior pituitary is also known as your neurohypophysis, and is actually composed of nervous tissue. There are neurons that are, the cell bodies are up in your hypothalamus, and then the axons run down that thin stalk, and the axon terminals are in the posterior pituitary. Okay, the anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis, and it's made up of actual glandular tissue. Okay, you've got endocrine cells in there that are secreting hormones. Okay, so here we've got the hypothalamus, and it's directly connected to both the posterior and anterior pituitary. Hey, your hypothalamus controls the anterior and the posterior pituitary. But it controls each gland differently. Okay, so the posterior pituitary, known as the neurohypophysis, okay, has neuroendocrine cells. Right? These are neurons that secrete their neurotransmitter into the bloodstream. Okay, usually when we think of neurons and them secreting neurotransmitters, they bind to a postsynaptic cell that's really close by. Right? But in this case, these neuroendocrine cells are neurons that release neurotransmitter by exocytosis, but because that neurotransmitter enters the bloodstream and travels to a distant target, instead of calling it a neurotransmitter, it's called a hormone or a neurohormone. Okay, the posterior pituitary releases hormones that it doesn't actually produce. They're produced by the cell bodies of the neurons up in the hypothalamus. Okay, so up in the hypothalamus, those neuron cell bodies, which have the nucleus and all the organelles, right, makes those neurohormones and their peptides, okay, packages them into secretory vesicles, sends them down the axon, and they hang out in the axon terminal. And then they're released by exocytosis when a action potential runs down the axon terminal. Okay, the posterior pituitary releases 2 peptide hormones. They are antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which is also known as vasopressin. Okay. I prefer antidiuretic hormone because it's way more descriptive. Okay, so what's diuresis? If you're in diuresis, do you pee a lot or just a little? When you're in diuresis, a lot. Right? So if you're given a diuretic, it causes diuresis and you pee a lot. So antidiuresis causes water reabsorption in the kidneys, right, to prevent diuresis. So when are you going to release antidiuretic hormone? When your blood osmolality increases or decreases? When there's an increase in solute in your blood or a decrease in solute in your blood? When there's an increase, which means osmolality is increased. And why would osmolality of your bloodstream increase? What haven't you been doing? Drinking water. Okay, so when you're dehydrated, hypothalamus fires action potentials, causes the release of antidiuretic hormone, okay, so that you produce low volume, highly concentrated urine. We're going to talk about antidiuretic hormone in detail when we talk about the urinary system in a couple of weeks. Well, next week, not a couple of weeks. Okay. Posterior pituitary also releases the hormone oxytocin. Okay, and in females, it stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth. Okay, so exogenous oxytocin, which is known as pitocin, is used to induce labor. Okay, so when a woman gets induced for labor, they give her exogenous oxytocin. Okay, and then it also causes milk ejection during breastfeeding. And in both these situations, uterine contractions and milk ejection, it works by positive feedback. Okay, but oxytocin also gets released in males and females and plays a role in what's called pair bond formation. It's known as the cuddle drug. Okay, so when you cuddle with someone, right, or have intercourse, you'll get release of oxytocin. Okay. When you hold a baby, you get a release of oxytocin. They did a study with dogs and cats, and when they gaze into their owner's eyes, which ones do you think release oxytocin? Dogs or cats? Dogs, cats don't. Okay, so the posterior pituitary releases those 2 hormones, antidiuretic and oxytocin, right? But the hypothalamus makes them. So your hypothalamus has neurosecretory cells. The cell bodies are in the supraoptic nucleus for the neurosecretory cells that secrete oxytocin, and in the paraventricular nucleus for the cells that secrete antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so when you get dehydrated, these neurons fire action potentials, cause exocytosis of antidiuretic hormone into the bloodstream. Okay, so the hypothalamus is directly connected to the posterior pituitary neurally. Okay, everyone fine with the posterior pituitary gland? Okay, let's look at the anterior pituitary gland now. Okay, the anterior pituitary gland makes and releases 6 different peptide hormones. Okay? All the hormones released by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are peptides. Okay? Pituitary does peptides. Okay, those 6 hormones, all except for prolactin, are trophic. So they cause the release of yet another hormone. Okay, so thyroid stimulating hormone, we already said, causes the release of thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone causes the release of cortisol. Follicle stimulating hormone causes the release of estrogen and testosterone in conjunction with luteinizing hormone. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone together will cause the release of sex steroids. So estrogen in females, testosterone in males. Okay, growth hormone is both direct acting as well as trophic because it causes the release of those insulin-like growth factors from the liver. Okay, and then prolactin doesn't cause the release of another hormone. It causes the production of milk. Okay, so the hypothalamus, even though it doesn't make the hormones the anterior pituitary releases, it controls the release of the anterior pituitary hormones. Okay, so the hypothalamus releases trophic hormones or inhibiting hormones to tell the anterior pituitary what to do. Okay, hypothalamus releases those hormones into a portal system, right? Then goes directly to the anterior pituitary, right? And we get regulation of anterior pituitary hormone secretion by those hypothalamic hormones and then by negative feedback, which we'll look at in a couple slides. Okay, so first let's look at those inhibiting or releasing hormones. So in this figure, we've got the hypothalamus, okay, which is part of the brain, so it's made up of neurons, okay? And then we have the anterior pituitary, which is an endocrine organ that's made up of endocrine cells, okay? And then we have the hormones being released and the target organs, many of which are endocrine glands and cause the release of yet another hormone. Okay, so if we look for, we'll first look at prolactin, because prolactin is not trophic. Okay, its target organ is breast and causes milk production. So prolactin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus tells anterior pituitary cells to release prolactin, which then causes milk production. Okay. Prolactin inhibiting hormone tells cells in the anterior pituitary not to produce prolactin. Okay. And then no prolactin means no milk production. Okay, so you can turn on milk production and you can turn it off. Right. In the hypothalamus, those neurosecretory cells release thyrotropic releasing hormone, which causes those anterior pituitary cells to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay. Corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Okay. Gonadotropin releasing hormone causes endocrine cells to release growth hormone, which causes the liver to release insulin-like growth factors. Oh, I say gonadotropin. Sorry. Growth hormone releasing hormone. Here's gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay. What you notice is that it either says releasing or inhibiting. Okay, so these hypothalamic trophic hormones, in their name, either have releasing or inhibiting. So that's how you know they're coming from the hypothalamus. So in a question, I might say blank releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone. And you know, okay, well that's from the hypothalamus. And then you have to know the anterior pituitary hormones. And if they're trophic, what hormone they cause the release of. Right? And I will ask you a quiz question, where you have to say which of the cascades is correct, and there will be an exam question. Okay, but just one. Right? And so these trophic anterior pituitary hormones then cause the release of yet another hormone. I mentioned that the hypothalamus releases those releasing or inhibiting hormones into a portal system, and a portal system is two capillary beds connected by a vein. Right? So you've got a capillary bed in the hypothalamus. Those neurosecretory cells release those peptide hormones by exocytosis, because all those releasing and inhibiting hormones are hydrophilic. Releases into the capillary bed, and then it goes into yet another capillary bed in the anterior pituitary, and it tells those endocrine cells to either release or not release their hormone. Okay, so the hypothalamus also controls the anterior pituitary. Okay, the anterior pituitary hormones are regulated by negative feedback. So let's use one where there's actually names. So the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which then acts on the adrenal gland and tells it to release cortisol. As cortisol levels rise, right, that cortisol negatively feeds back and stops the production of both ACTH and CRH. Okay? ACTH could also work by what's called a short feedback loop, and as ACTH levels rise, it turns off CRH production. Okay? Since we have two trophic hormones, the short acting is where the anterior pituitary shuts off hypothalamic hormone release. Long is where the last hormone from the actual endocrine gland shuts off the production of anterior pituitary and hypothalamic hormones. Okay, so regulated by negative feedback to get stable levels of the particular hormone in the bloodstream. Okay, so besides the pituitary gland, the pineal gland is also considered a central endocrine organ because your pineal gland is located in the center of your brain. Okay, and it's an endocrine organ because its main role is to release the hormone melatonin. Okay, your pineal gland is photosensitive. It detects light. Or it receives signals from your eyes to detect light. Okay. So it knows day length. Okay. Melatonin is an amine hormone. Okay, it's synthesized from tryptophan. It is water soluble. Okay, tryptophan is found in high abundance in turkey, so that is why people think that you get really sleepy after Thanksgiving dinner because you've eaten a bunch of turkey and taken a bunch of tryptophan. That's not true. The reason you get really sleepy is because you ate like a pig, right? Right. It is known as the hormone of darkness, not because it's evil or released by vampires in high abundance, okay, but because secretion falls to low levels during daylight. Okay, so because we are diurnal, when we have high melatonin levels, that makes us sleepy. Right? So it helps keep our circadian rhythms in synchrony with light-dark cycles. And this is one of the reasons why shift workers have such a hard problem with sleep, because they're trying to stay awake when it's dark and melatonin's being pumped out by their pineal gland, and then they try to sleep when it's light when they have low melatonin levels. Okay, so melatonin is a really common dietary supplement because it does help promote sleep for people who are having trouble sleeping. Okay, it influences reproductive activity. It sort of is a timekeeper. It tells your body how many years you've been alive. So it's part of the circadian rhythm cycle. And so then that helps with the onset of puberty at the correct time. Okay, it also acts as an antioxidant, right, which is also why it's a really popular dietary supplement. However, if you want to use it for its antioxidant abilities, I still recommend taking it at night, right? Okay, and then it also enhances immunity, okay, and it's readily absorbed, considered a very safe supplement. Any questions about melatonin? Yeah.
So you talked about how it kind of keeps the body at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
So would melatonin supplements throw puberty off? Like would they happen earlier or later?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that melatonin supplements are considered safe for kids, and they recommend them for kids who are having sleep problems. I don't know if anyone's done a long-term study to see if that might set them into puberty at a younger age. Kids are experiencing puberty at a younger age anyway.
I think they are adding some cautions to using melatonin chronically in children.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know what the reasons why. I've just heard that.
Right, exactly. I know they often say don't take it chronically because then they think that you might not produce your own melatonin if you're taking it chronically. Yeah, in both adults and probably in kids. But whether or not there's been a tie to early puberty and melatonin supplements, I don't know. But that could be a possible concern. Okay, any other melatonin questions? So we're going to move out of the central endocrine organs and talk about the peripheral endocrine organs. So these are outside the central nervous system. And the first one we'll talk about is the thyroid gland. So you have two lobes to your thyroid gland. Okay, it's right below your larynx. And those two lobes are connected by a narrow portion. Your thyroid gland releases two hormones. Okay? It releases thyroid hormone, which is nice because it's thyroid hormones coming from the thyroid gland, but it also releases calcitonin. Okay, thyroid hormone is an amine hormone. Calcitonin is a peptide hormone. So not only does it release two different hormones, it releases two different types of hormones. Okay, because the thyroid gland releases two types of hormones, it has two types of secretory cells, and each cell type secretes a different hormone. So the follicular cells are arranged in these hollow spheres. They surround this colloid. Okay, so the lumen that's surrounded by the follicular cells is filled with a colloid. And a colloid is a suspension of hydrophobic substances in a watery matrix. So blood is a colloid. We have all those plasma proteins, which are suspending all that stuff that's not water soluble in our bloodstream. Okay, the thyroid gland also has a colloid, and that is holding thyroid hormone inside of it. So remember how we were talking about the steps of hydrophilic versus hydrophobic hormones, and we said hydrophobic just diffuse away from their synthesizing cells, so they have to be made on demand. Thyroid hormone breaks that rule. Okay, so those follicular cells make thyroid hormone, and then they put it into the colloid, and the colloid stores it. So this allows thyroid hormone to release, or the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone on demand. Okay, there's two forms of thyroid hormone. One is tetraiodothyronine. It has 4 iodine molecules. That's where the 4 comes from. It's also known as T4 or thyroxine. And then triiodothyronine, one of the iodine molecules gets clipped off, so it only has 3 iodine molecules, so it's called T3. Okay, both tetraiodothyronine is the precursor to triiodothyronine, and both are made from the amino acid tyrosine. Okay, so they're amine hormones, and they're hydrophobic. Right, but they break the rule of hydrophobic hormones in the fact that they are stored and released on demand. The other type of cell are called C cells, right? And they make and secrete calcitonin, which is a peptide hormone. Okay, so they make it, store it in vesicles, and then release it by exocytosis. And calcitonin regulates calcium balance. Okay, so here we have an actual micrograph of the thyroid gland. Okay, so here are those follicular cells that are surrounding the colloid. Okay, and the colloid is the storage site for thyroid hormone. Okay, thyroid hormone is essential for life. It is the main determinant of what's called your basal metabolic rate. Okay, so that's sort of the pace your cells run at when you are resting. Okay, and some people have an inherently higher basal metabolic rate than others. Okay, so think of the people who eat nothing but McDonald's and donuts and are still really skinny, okay, and hate them. And then there might be you that have to watch what you eat, you know, in order to maintain a reasonable body size. Okay, and that can be due to the amount of thyroid hormone. Okay, but we're going to talk about why you just don't take more thyroid hormone in order to lose weight. Okay, there's some negative side effects. The thyroid gland influences the synthesis and degradation of the macronutrients, so carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Okay, so how fast you store it versus break it down. Okay, one of the problems with thyroid hormone is it increases target cell responsiveness to the catecholamines. And who memorized what the catecholamines are? Or who remembers? Or who took notes? The catecholamines are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then dopamine. Okay? So epinephrine, norepinephrine are part of the sympathetic nervous system. So thyroid hormone, high levels of thyroid hormone means that your body's even more responsive than norepinephrine and epinephrine, okay, which causes vasoconstriction. So too high levels of thyroid hormone is going to cause hypertension. Okay, also increase heart rate. So people who are hyperthyroid have arrhythmias. They feel like their heart's going to beat out of their chest. And this is why we don't take thyroid hormone as a diet drug. Okay, because it has a nasty side effect of causing hypertension and high heart rates. Okay, increases heart rate and force of contraction. Okay, enough thyroid hormone though is essential for normal growth, especially early on in development. It is essential for the normal development of the nervous system. Okay, so you want just the right amount of thyroid hormone for normal nervous system development and for regular growth. Okay, calcitonin is the other hormone. That's a peptide hormone produced by the C cells of the thyroid gland. It's regulated in a negative feedback fashion. When blood calcium levels increase, calcitonin is released. Okay, so hypercalcemia, high blood calcium levels, causes the thyroid gland to release calcitonin. Okay, and calcitonin helps lower plasma calcium levels by inhibiting bone osteoclasts. Okay, so you have cells in your bone, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts cause the storage of calcium. They build bone. Osteoclast causes the release of calcium. Right? Why do we want to regulate blood calcium levels anyway? What does calcium play a role in? Cardiac cycle, that's true. Okay, so proper beating of the heart. What else does it play a role in? Action potentials. Okay, so nervous system function. What else does it play a role in? What other type of muscle? Well, actually, all types of muscle. Okay, skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. Okay, so calcium is extremely important for excitable cells. So we tightly regulate blood calcium levels. High blood calcium levels are a rarity. Okay, hypercalcemia is rare. Hypocalcemia is way more common. So we consider calcitonin not essential for life. So we'll talk about, a lot of times people have their thyroid glands removed because of thyroid hormone issues. Okay, when you get your thyroid gland removed, they don't care about calcitonin. Okay, you're not going to take calcitonin injections because it's not considered essential for life. Because hypercalcemia is much rarer than hypocalcemia. Okay, the thyroid gland has loads of issues, so this is why we're going to talk about some abnormalities. Okay, one is hypothyroidism, and this could be primary due to the fact that the thyroid gland is not working, Or it can be secondary, which is a deficiency in thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is released from the, what all releasing or inhibiting hormones come from the, no, hypothalamus. They control the release of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So thyroid stimulating hormone comes from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so a problem with the hypothalamus or anterior pituitary can cause secondary hypothyroidism, or you can have an inadequate dietary supply of iodine. Thyroid hormone is the only molecule in the human body that needs iodine. Right? Yeah.
So are you saying that, or is hypothyroidism an underproduction of calcitonin and thyroid hormone?
No, it's just an underproduction of thyroid hormone. It has nothing to do with calcitonin. So if you're hypothyroid, you don't produce enough thyroid hormone. Okay, good question. Hypothyroidism is you don't produce enough thyroid hormone. Okay, if you are hypothyroid at birth or during development, it can cause cretinism, okay, which is lack of brain growth as well as overall growth. Okay, so you get severe mental retardation. Okay, the treatment is you either take thyroid hormone, and you can take thyroid hormone orally, okay, or if it's a dietary iodine problem, you take some dietary iodine. Okay, but people who live in areas with very low iodine levels, oftentimes you'll see incidences of cretinism, right? Because if the mother's not getting enough iodine, she's not producing enough thyroid hormone, and her infant is also not going to get enough iodine and produce enough thyroid hormone. Okay, hyperthyroidism is also really common. Okay, and the most common cause is an autoimmune disease called Graves' disease. Okay, and in Graves' disease, the body produces antibodies that are called thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulins. Okay, so they're antibodies that bind to the receptor for thyroid-stimulating hormone on the thyroid glands. And then they tell the thyroid gland to produce more thyroid hormone, okay, which ramps up metabolism, okay, causes hypertension, causes racing heart rate, and then causes bug eyes. Okay, so the exothalamus is the eyes start bugging out of your head. Okay. So this is why we don't give excess thyroid hormone as a diet drug. Hey, so treatment for hyperthyroidism is surgically removing part of the thyroid glands, or more commonly, they give you radioactive iodine. Because again, thyroid gland is the only organ in the body that uses iodine. Okay, so if you give someone radioactive iodine, it all ends up in the thyroid gland and kills it off. But for a few days, you are radioactive. Okay. Or if it's not super severe, they may just give you anti-thyroid drugs. Once they remove your thyroid glands, okay, either surgically or through radioactive iodine, you then take thyroid hormone orally the rest of your life. And again, they don't care about calcitonin. Okay. You guys have probably all heard about goiters. This goiter is obviously in someone who doesn't see regular medical care. Usually you're not going to let your goiter get that big before you go and see a doctor. Okay, but if you don't have access to medical care, you can see these large goiters. This one is probably from an area with low iodine concentrations in the diet. You can get goiter from hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. Okay, hypothyroidism caused by dietary iodine or no dietary iodine will cause a goiter. And the reason it causes a goiter is because your hypothalamus and anterior pituitary keep signaling to the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormone, but it doesn't have any iodine, so it can't make thyroid hormone. So there's no negative feedback. Okay, and trophic hormones cause the maintenance or increase in the size of their target organs. Okay, so that thyroid stimulating hormone keeps stimulating the thyroid to enlarge in size in hopes that it'll eventually make some thyroid hormone. But until you get iodine, it's not going to happen. Okay, this goiter would have to be removed surgically. Okay, hyperthyroidism, so Graves' disease, also causes goiter formation because those thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins, those antibodies that your B cells are producing, act like thyroid stimulating hormone, so you produce more thyroid hormone and your thyroid increases in size. Okay. In addition to your thyroid glands, right near your larynx is the parathyroid glands. Okay, they're about the size of a grain of rice, and you've got 4 of them, and they're closely associated with your thyroid gland. So if you have your thyroid gland removed surgically, they'll take your parathyroid glands, and they often insert them in your wrist. Okay. If you have your thyroid gland removed by radioactive iodine, your parathyroid glands just stay. Okay, they're not affected by the iodine. If you have it surgically removed, which is one of the reasons why surgical removal of your thyroid gland isn't as common, is because they have to be really careful of your parathyroid glands. Your parathyroid glands secrete a hormone, parathyroid hormone, that is a peptide hormone that also regulates calcium balance. However, it is essential for life. Okay, so calcitonin helps decrease calcium levels, so it's released in response to hypercalcemia, which is uncommon. Parathyroid hormone is released due to hypocalcemia, or lowering of blood calcium levels, which is much more common. Okay, so parathyroid hormone is a peptide hormone, and it is the primary regulator of blood calcium levels. Okay? So in response to a decrease in blood calcium, parathyroid hormone gets released, and then it causes an increase in plasma calcium levels by causing an increase in calcium release from the bone. Okay, so it inhibits osteoblasts and instead activates those osteoclasts. So it's going to cause calcium release from bone. It's going to tell your kidneys to reabsorb more calcium. So we'll talk about parathyroid hormone again when we talk about kidneys next week. It also increases calcium absorption from your intestines, okay, because it plays a role in activating vitamin D. So normally, you do not absorb all of the calcium in your diet, okay, because you don't want to have this huge influx of calcium into the bloodstream because it will alter the function of excitable cells. Okay, so you tightly regulate how much calcium you absorb from your diet. And you regulate it via parathyroid hormones regulation of vitamin D. Okay, so it is considered essential for life because hypocalcemia can be fatal because your excitable cells won't function properly without high enough calcium levels. Okay, on to the next endocrine glands, the thymus. Okay, so the thymus is in the upper part of your thoracic cavity, and it's largest in teenagers, and then it starts to regress, right, as you get older. It secretes the hormone thymosin, and the hormone thymosin regulates T cell function. We'll talk about T cells when we talk about the immune system, but they're part of the cell-mediated branch of the acquired immune system. So your T cells have specific targets that they're looking for. Okay, and thymosin is important for T cell replication, right? So that you have a whole bunch of different T cells, and they all have different types of receptors that have different targets. Okay, so thymosin plays a major role in immune system development. Okay, on to the next endocrine organ. We're going to talk about the adrenal glands. We already talked about the adrenal medulla, right? It's considered a modified ganglion of the sympathetic nervous system and releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so the adrenal gland has two functionally distinct areas. Okay, the medulla is in the middle and it secretes catecholamines. And then the cortex is the outer portion and it secretes steroid hormones. And your adrenal glands look like lumps of fat sitting on top of your kidneys. So you have two of them. Okay, so here we've got cross-section, so an actual micrograph versus a cartoon of the adrenal cortex. Okay, and here's the medulla, which is that middle portion. Okay, so we have the zona glomerulosa, that's the outermost layer, the zona fasciculata, which is the middle layer, and then that zona reticularis, which is the innermost layer. Okay, and the cortex portion secretes steroid hormones. Okay, and the medulla does the catecholamines. Are catecholamines hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Who remembers? Epinephrine or norepinephrine? Hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Got a 50-50 chance of guessing right. Hydrophilic, good. Steroid hormones, hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophobic. Okay, so it secretes two very different types of hormones. Okay, so the adrenal cortex releases steroid hormones, and those steroid hormones are the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and some amount of sex hormones. But the vast majority of sex hormones are secreted by the gonads. Okay, small amounts get secreted by the adrenal cortex. So the mineralocorticoids regulate ions or minerals. Okay, and the mineralocorticoid that we're going to talk about next week is aldosterone, which plays a major role in regulating sodium and potassium levels, okay, which are minerals. So the mineralocorticoids regulate mineral levels, and we'll talk about aldosterone because it functions at the kidneys, okay, and it tells the kidneys to increase sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. Okay, the glucocorticoid cortisol helps regulate blood glucose levels. Okay, it antagonizes insulin. Right? Cortisol is a steroid hormone that plays a role in the stress response. Cortisol is all about getting as many nutrients into the bloodstream as possible for the fight or flight response. Okay, and because it is hydrophobic, it stays in the bloodstream for a much longer time than epinephrine and norepinephrine. Right? So cortisol plays a major role in the long-term response to stress. Okay? And one of the things that cortisol does is that dampens down your immune system. Because your immune system is kind of energetically expensive. So if you're in chronic stress, right, it basically tells the immune system to just dial it down a little bit. And then you get sick. Okay? So that's why during finals, you always come down with a cold or something because you're under enormous amounts of stress. Or at least you should be, right? Okay? And so you're pumping out cortisol like crazy and it's dampening down the immune system. Okay? Cortisol also causes the release of nutrients into the bloodstream. And some of those nutrients are amino acids. So cortisol, high levels of cortisol over a long period of time will cause muscle wasting. Okay? And one of the really stressful things you can do to your body is not give it enough nutrients. Okay? So people who go on severe diets end up having high cortisol release, and then they'll have their muscles being mobilized, and your muscles are normally a great source of getting rid of excess energy. Okay, and so that's why people hit a plateau. They might lose a bunch of weight all at once, but on really caloric restrictive diets, they'll hit a plateau, their metabolism will drop, and all that's due to cortisol. Right? And then the sex hormones, right, help regulate reproductive function. And in general, it's testosterone, but just low levels. Right? gonads produce a lot more of the sex hormones. Okay, on to the next endocrine organ, the pancreas. Right? The pancreas is closely associated with your GI tract. Okay, so the stomach is being shown as see-through here. Okay, because the pancreas is dorsal to the stomach. It has both endocrine and exocrine function. Okay, so the endocrine function is to secrete hormones into the bloodstream. The exocrine function is to secrete digestive enzymes and bicarbonate into the small intestine. So we'll talk about the pancreas again when we talk about the GI tract in a couple of weeks. Right? We're talking about it now because the endocrine portion of the pancreas releases two hormones, insulin and glucagon. And what do insulin and glucagon regulate? Blood sugar, in specific blood glucose. And why do we regulate blood glucose? Why do we even care? What organ in particular really cares about blood glucose? The brain, right? Because it will only run on glucose. So we have to maintain a high enough level of blood glucose, right? Resting level of blood glucose in humans is about 90 milligrams per deciliter. That's the level of glucose we need in our bloodstream so that our brain gets a constant supply. Okay? Dips below 70 and you go hypoglycemic. Someone who's hypoglycemic, are they a pleasure to be around? No, they are cranky. They're hangry. Okay? That's because their brain is super unhappy. It's not getting enough glucose. All right, why not let glucose levels go super high? If the brain loves glucose so much, why not more? Huh? You die. Not immediately, though, right? What are the long-term consequences of uncontrolled diabetes? What are the side effects? You what? You lose a limb. Exactly. All right, you get neuropathy where you no longer feel the bottom of your feet, right? And so then you put them too close to the fire and they burn, right? That's not usually the reason why you lose a limb, but it happens frequently in people who have diabetic neuropathy. Or circulation gets really poor, right? And that's the more common cause because those capillary beds get damaged by all that glucose. Yeah?
I was going to say another side effect of that, don't they also have vision problems?
Yes, retinopathy. That's called retinopathy. The capillary beds in your retinas get damaged, right, by all that glucose. Right? We love to use glucose to make it to ATP because it's reactive. Right? You put too much of that into your bloodstream and it starts to react with things. It starts to glycosylate things. And in capillary beds, that damages them. It damages the ends of neurons, and that causes neuropathy. Right? So there's lots of really nasty side effects to really high blood glucose levels for a long period of time. Someone who is just being diagnosed, so it's usually a young child with type 1 diabetes, what's usually the symptom of type 1 diabetes where you don't produce any insulin? So then your blood glucose levels go really high. Anyone know?
Excessive thirst.
Excessive thirst because of excessive urination. Right? Because if you have too much glucose in your bloodstream, you can't reabsorb it all in your kidneys, and you produce high volume urine that's high in glucose. So in the urinalysis lab, you'll get to do dipsticks and see if you're diabetic. Okay? If you have spilled any glucose into your urine. Right? Okay, so insulin and glucagon are antagonistic. Okay, insulin gets released in response to an increase in blood glucose. Okay, so you drink a bunch of Gatorade. That sugar gets rapidly absorbed. That increase in blood glucose gets detected by the pancreas. It releases insulin. Okay, and the beta cells, which are being shown in green, release insulin. Insulin then binds to insulin-sensitive cells, like your skeletal muscle, your adipocytes, your hepatocytes, and it tells them to absorb glucose. So if insulin's not in the bloodstream, right, your adipocytes, skeletal muscle, hepatocytes in your liver don't absorb glucose. They leave it for the brain. Okay, but when insulin's in the bloodstream, insulin's signaling that, hey, we got loads of glucose, go ahead, take it up, use it or store it. Okay, so they'll use it or they'll store it as glycogen or as fats We're talking about the adipocytes. Okay, when you haven't eaten for a while, okay, so if you don't get up and have your midnight snack, by morning time, blood glucose levels will be falling, and your pancreas instead is going to be releasing glucagon. And there it's released by the alpha cells, which are being shown in blue here. Okay, and so glucagon causes the release of glucose from your glucagon-sensitive cells, which are the same as the insulin-sensitive cells. So it tells your hepatocytes to break down the glycogen it's stored and release the glucose. Okay, also tells your hepatocytes to start doing gluconeogenesis, so making glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors. So people who went on the Atkins diet, right, which was that carbohydrate-free diet, still maintained 90 milligrams per deciliter of glucose in their bloodstream because they just synthesized it from the excess amino acids, right? Okay, so they are antagonistic. Insulin brings down glucose levels, glucagon brings them up. Okay, so people who are type 1 diabetic are insulin dependent. Okay, so they don't produce any insulin. And it's usually also called early onset, because what happens is that beta cells get destroyed in kids, right? And then they don't produce any insulin. And then they have to take insulin shots their entire life. Type 2 or adult onset is when you're insulin insensitive. So you produce plenty of insulin, but your insulin sensitive cells don't respond anymore, right? And if you don't control it well, insulin insensitive type 2 diabetes can turn into type 1, where you basically blow out your pancreas. Okay. All right. Last endocrine organ we'll talk about are the gonads. And we'll talk in more detail about these guys when we talk about the reproductive system. So males have testes that produce testosterone. Females have ovaries that produce 2 steroid hormones, estradiol or estrogen and progesterone. Okay, progesterone is the precursor to testosterone, and testosterone is the precursor to estrogen. Fun fact. Okay, and they're all made from cholesterol. Okay. The other endocrine organ that's only present in pregnant females is the placenta. Okay, so the placenta also produces estrogen and progesterone. Okay, later in pregnancy, the placenta is the major source of those 2 hormones to maintain pregnancy. Early in pregnancy, the placenta produces what's called human chorionic gonadotropin. This is not a steroid hormone, this is a peptide hormone. Okay, it's also known as HCG. And what HCG does is it signals to the ovaries to keep producing estrogen and progesterone early in the pregnancy, okay, to maintain the uterus in a nice, quiet state. And then once the fetus is large enough and the placenta is large enough, the placenta takes over in producing the estrogen and progesterone. HCG is what pregnancy tests are detecting. Okay. It's a peptide hormone, and it is excreted in the urine. Okay. HCG for a while was popular as a diet drug. Did any of you do the HCG diet? No? No, you guys are all too young to have tried it. Okay. You heard about it. A few years ago, there were a number of students who had tried it. So what they do with the HCG diet, the idea is that if you took HCG and then went on a super low caloric diet, you tricked your body into thinking you're pregnant. So pregnant women will continue to mobilize body fat stores even due to low calorie diets because they're basically sacrificing their own body for the development of the fetus. Okay, so they don't have super high cortisol levels that's ramping down their metabolism. Instead, they maintain a high metabolism, so they sacrifice their own body stores for their fetus. So if you trick your body into thinking you're pregnant, you can go on a low-calorie diet and not hit that plateau. But it seemed like a horrible idea because you're tricking your body into thinking you're pregnant, and then you're going on a low-calorie diet. And I don't know if you've been around pregnant women, but you don't want to get between them and their food, right? Okay, it causes a huge increase in appetite. And they're also doing it orally. And what's the problem with taking peptide hormones orally? It doesn't work, Exactly. So unless you were injecting it, it wasn't going to work. Okay.